Welcome to this new faith group study, Ripped from the Headlines, the chaos of Judges and the chaos of today. This topic suggested itself because the last couple of years in our country have been marked by an unsettling sense of chaos. The COVID-19 pandemic caused anxiety and terror and tremendous disruption in our lives. Riots across the U.S. seem to undercut generations of progress on racial relations. We saw perhaps a necessary but disastrous end to our long war in Afghanistan. Inflation is taking off. There have been droughts, fires, and floods. Insane levels of violence in too many of our large cities. And meanwhile, Christianity seems to be ever more disfavored or marginalized, sometimes even treated as irrelevant or evil. And so it can start to feel like the wheels are coming off. You may be wondering, can the apocalypse be far off? Well, there is some comfort in knowing that events like this have occurred before. TV shows or movies often say that they are based on actual events or ripped from the headlines. And the book of Judges especially seems to fit that description. Its accounts reflect many of the troubles that are bedeviling our world today. Only these aren't movie or TV scripts. These are historical accounts. Judges describes a really troubled time in the history of Israel, which is both ironic and tragic. God had brought the people into the promised land of Canaan, and that fulfilled a promise God had made to Abraham centuries before. It should have been a golden age for the chosen people of God. But instead, signs of trouble abounded. Already in Numbers 25, before the people even came into the promised land, they had begun to worship the Baals and other false gods. And so Joshua, who led them into the promised land, challenged them. He challenged the people to commit either to serve God or to serve idols, but not to try to do both. In Joshua 24, the people fervently responded, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord and serve other gods." Sounded good, but Joshua wasn't buying it. "You cannot serve the Lord," he responded, "for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins." Or the shorthand version is, "Don't say it if you don't mean it." Sadly, though, the Israelites did say it, but didn't come close to meaning it. And so what should have been good times in Israel were marked instead by idolatry and suffering, oppression by enemies, and internal conflict among the tribes. And all of that distress led to a growing breakdown in society. And so, amidst these troubled times in our world, it makes Judges an ideal book to study amidst our world. And as we delve into this book, we have several goals in mind. One is to learn more about a riveting, great, but perhaps lesser-known book of the Bible. And from that, then, we hope to see how God's people faced struggles that are similar to our own. And then learn how God responded to his people, both to discipline them and to save them. And then finally, out of that story, to draw encouragement and direction for the living of these days. And so to do that, we will consider the accounts of the 6 major judges in Israel to see how these ancient events seem to be ripped from the headlines today. We will draw lessons and hear the promises of God's actions and our response. Now, in the book of Judges, God's dealings with his unfaithful people follow a clear 4-step pattern. The first place that it's laid out is in Judges 2. You can read that text later, but here are the steps. First, the Israelites worshipped false gods. They really belonged to foreign nations, the very gods God had warned them not to worship. So then, secondly, in anger, God delivered them into the hands of their enemies, subjecting them to oppression and suffering. Well, third, after just so much of that suffering, the Israelites would cry out to God for deliverance to save them. And the fourth step is that God, out of his steadfast love for Israel, would raise up a judge to deliver them. Now, that pattern points to the nature of these judges in Israel. They were not like judges today who preside in a court over criminal or civil legal matters. Instead, these were leaders who were called up and raised up and equipped by God for particular service at a particular time. And these judges served only for their own lifetimes. They were not and did not try to form dynasties. God was to be the king in Israel. The judges were simply instruments of his rule in key crises. But now, having said that, these judges were an interesting lot. Several of them were not very respectable folks. Few had any leadership role before God called them to be a judge. Some of their stories are humorous, some are exciting, some a bit scandalous, even offensive. None fit the pattern of a saint. All involve violence and warfare that can be really disturbing for us, especially as we read it from the Bible. And because of that, it's really crucial that we don't try to hold the judges to modern societal standards or even to proper Christian ethics. As Thomas Hobbes famously noted, life in the ancient world was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The world then was just soaked in violence and bloodshed, inhumanity. And the book of Judges makes no attempt to disguise that or to pretend otherwise. The world was a really rough place at that time. But in part because of that, and another reason not to overlook it or disguise it, is that it shows the depth of God's commitment to his chosen people and to the covenant he made with them. In most ways, the Israelites were not faithful or moral or admirable at all. And God didn't intervene and again and again to save them because they somehow deserved that. In fact, they actually deserved just the opposite. But God saved them because of his undying, steadfast love for them, which is still true today. God continues to save sinners because of his divine love and commitment. So that's as true for us as it was for ancient Israel. And there's part of the comfort that we can draw from these stories. Well, the first headline to be ripped from Judges to reflect on our world today reads, "King of Moab slain, left-hander at large." And it describes the story of the first major judge, that is one that is told at any length at all. It's the story of Ehud, who was indeed a left-handed warrior. Now you can follow along in your Bibles as we go through this. We're not going to read the text yet. Again, you can do that later. But Ehud's story begins in Judges chapter 3, verse 12. And the first paragraph, you'll note, repeats this pattern that marks the book of Judges. Verse 12 says, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They were determined idolaters. And no matter how many times God called them away from that or rescued them from it, they just kept going back. It's almost tiresome how dense and thick-headed they were. That is, of course, until I look in the mirror and say, oh, yeah, well, me too. That's the nature of sinners. And so God delivered them into the hands of their enemies as punishment and discipline on them. And the enemy in this case is King Eglon of Moab. Moab was a country to the east and a little bit to the south of Israel on the east side of the Jordan River. Moab was one of Israel's persistent enemies. They show up again and again throughout the Old Testament. And so after so many years of being oppressed by Eglon, the Israelites cried out to God for mercy, and he raised up Ehud as their deliverer. Now, the word deliverer there is just a synonym for a judge. It's the same role as all the judges had. Now, you may wonder why the author would go out of his way to tell us that Ehud was left-handed. Who cares? Well, actually, it's very significant because cultures across the world have universally favored the right hand over the left. Part of that was because the left hand was reserved for unpleasant duty, especially in a day before there was Charmin or Angel Soft. And so a left-handed soldier was truly rare. And that suggests an unexpected advantage for Ehud. Well, in any case, he was sent to pay the tribute to King Eglon. And the tribute here is what today we would call taxes. Even then, foreign policy was concerned with money. And now in verse 16, the author relates another apparently random fact in great detail. He wants readers first to note the length of the blade that Ehud carried. A cubit was roughly the length from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger of an adult male. It was roughly 18 inches, although obviously it varied depending on the height of the person. So a sword that's 2 cubits is longer than a dagger, but shorter than a longsword. It's a significant weapon, but one that you can conceal. And then secondly, note where Ehud strapped on this sword. The right thigh is the opposite place of where a sword would normally be carried. Right-handers reach across to the left side to pull out a sword, but Ehud reaches to the right side to pull it out with his left hand. Moreover, Ehud was the first practitioner of concealed carry. He kept this weapon under his robe so that it wasn't evident to anyone. And that helps preserve the element of surprise. Well, as we'll see later, verse 17 is not kidding about just how fat King Eglon of Moab was. But it's important for us to realize that in the ancient world, to be fat was a sign of prestige and wealth and status. It signified that the king didn't have to do any manual labor, as most of his subjects did. It was also living proof that he had more than enough to eat in a time when most people lived hand to mouth on a subsistence diet. But in this case, especially given that Eglon is so very, very obese, it indicates his arrogance, his complacency, his overconfidence as he deals with Ehud. Well, now starting in verse 18, Ehud comes off as a kind of ancient version of James Bond. First, he appealed to King Eglon's ego in order to lower his defenses. I mean, seriously, what king in his right mind would agree to meet alone with a warrior of a foreign nation? But the notion of a secret message, something for his ears only, that made Eglon feel very important. And he just dropped his defenses, sent out all his advisors to meet alone with Ehud. It may also sound a little odd to hear about a cool roof chamber. We think of being on a roof as very hot. But that was up where the breezes blew. And these kinds of rooms were quite common in wealthy homes or in palaces. But most importantly, it was out of the way, not a part of where the palace staff would be normally going. And in a hot climate, with his enormous size, Eglon no doubt appreciated those cool breezes. In verse 21, we see Ehud make full use of his tactical advantage. I mean, King Eglon wouldn't instinctively react to a left hand moving. It was a beautiful bit of trickery to give Ehud the upper hand. And then verse 22 makes astonishingly clear just how fat Eglon was. A 2-foot sword plus the hilt is just swallowed up in his gut. It's hard even to imagine. And then the text sort of carefully says, and the dirt came out. What that means is he was dead and lost control of his bowels as his guts spilled out on the floor. Now, these descriptions are not the least bit politically correct. But just imagine Israel's delight as they heard these stories told of how their oppressor enemy king was fooled and dispatched by Ehud, the left-handed warrior. In fact, to this day, kids often love a story like this. In some ways, it's laugh-out-loud funny. And doubly so with the hilarious scene that follows. In verse 23, Ehud locks the doors of the cool roof chamber in order to flee. But Eglon's servants come and assume that, of course, the king locked his own door, and they would have needed his permission to interrupt him. Plus, kings were rarely, if ever, alone and unattended. And so the servants stand outside the door, assuming that it's locked because King Eglon is doing his business. But as time passes, their embarrassment and their discomfort grow as they're waiting and waiting and waiting. I mean, get the poor man some X-Lax, will you? But it's a brilliant move by Ehud, because he knows those servants will have to wait by the door to see what's going to happen. And that gives him time to escape and get back to Israel. However, the humor and the ridicule of an enemy is not the most important part of this. Far more significant was the astounding victory over a much stronger enemy. Ehud managed single-handedly to assassinate an enemy king and get entirely away. I mean, by himself, he freed Israel from her oppressor. And so you note in verse 27, Ehud's courage and success then rallied the Israelites to fight. But note that the text only mentions people from, or men from, the hill country of Ephraim. Now, Ephraim was perhaps the dominant tribe in north-central Israel, but not the whole country. Much later, Ephraim becomes kind of a nickname for the whole northern kingdom, but at this time, it's just one of the 12 tribes. And this, too, is typical of the book of Judges. It does not portray Israel as a united nation with a central government, but rather a loose confederation of tribes that didn't always get along very well or even have a lot to do with one another. In the book of Judges, the picture of Israel is not of a united nation with central governance, but a loose confederation of tribes that didn't always agree with one another or get along very well with one another. The technical term for that kind of confederation is an amphictyony. So you can use that to impress your friends at coffee tomorrow. Now, Ehud himself was from the tribe of Benjamin, so there may have been more than just one tribe that responded, but most accounts in Judges involve only a limited portion of Israel. Now, it notes that they closed off the Jordan River. The Jordan River served as a border with Moabite territory. But note way back in verse 13 that the Moabites had occupied the city of palms. That refers to Jericho, which was on the west side of the Jordan River. And so closing the fords of the Jordan was chiefly to prevent their escape. That accounts for the death total of Moabite soldiers that we read in verse 29. And then finally, verse 30 is a typical ending for the accounts of the judges. Having defeated their oppressors, each judge then ruled for his or her lifetime. But the numbers that are given for their reigns are round and imprecise. We find 20 and 40 and 80 frequently. But really about all that means is short, medium, and long. It's really not a lot more precise than that. In fact, in the Crossways Bible study that I teach, the author Harry Wendt has written, attempts to determine the total period of years Israel was ruled by judges can be futile. I think I would just say is futile. It's just not that precise. Now, those are the kinds of details that just fascinate modern readers. We want the facts, the dates, the times, but those kind of details weren't of that much interest to ancient people. For them, the story was paramount. How Ehud, the left-handed warrior, was raised up by God, how cleverly he attacked and defeated King Eglon, and how that led to a great victory of Israel over her enemy, Moab. So this shortest account of the major judges, there are much shorter accounts of the minor ones, sets the main themes for all the rest to follow. The Israelites were not victims, but richly deserved the punishment that they received from God. Likewise, God delivered them out of sheer mercy and grace, out of loyalty to the covenant of Sinai that God had made with them, despite the people's disloyalty to that covenant. Thirdly, the judges were clever and courageous, but only because God raised them up and equipped them with the gifts they needed to lead in this way. These really are not hero stories in Judges. God is the only hero. And as we'll see, many of the judges to follow are more like anti-heroes. And then finally, it shows that for as much as has changed in the world, much is still the same. But now making those connections will be the topic of your discussion. So have some good conversation together, and we'll see you for session 2.